I refuse to move in with my boyfriend because I don't want to take care of his kids. I am a 22-year-old woman and my boyfriend is 29. I am an only child, so I never grew up surrounded by little kids. Although I have younger cousins, I have never felt particularly close to children and have always been against the idea of having them because I simply didn't like them. But my boyfriend has definitely helped change my perspective a lot, and I no longer rule out the idea of having kids, though clearly in the distant future, as neither of us is currently ready for a baby. My boyfriend's children are between 5 and 8 years old. They are charming, funny, and I get along very well with them. Every day, I make an effort to build a good relationship with them despite not being someone who likes kids. I currently live alone and really enjoy my space and freedom. I have plans to go to university, but at the moment I have 3 jobs and love spending time outdoors. My partner currently lives with his mother and grandmother, who help him with the kids, but both of them will be moving to another state soon. My boyfriend and I have talked about moving in together this year when my lease ends. Considering we've only been dating for 3 months, at first it didn't seem like a bad idea, until I started realizing that he expects a lot from me when it comes to the kids, a responsibility I don't feel ready to take on. So far, I don't mind spending time with them and helping him when he needs me, but I don't want to be responsible for their daily well-being. When I recently told him that I don't feel ready to be a mother and that I don't want to have kids of my own because quite literally I am not ready and don't want that responsibility, he said, "Then why are you with me knowing that I have 2 kids?" And on other occasions, when I mentioned that I never eat breakfast because I hate waking up early to cook since I'm always tired from work, he asked something like, "So you wouldn't make breakfast for my kids? Or what would you do when you have to take them to school?" That kind of thing made me realize that maybe moving in together is not a good idea and is happening too soon because I feel like he expects me to take on a responsibility I'm not ready for. Since that conversation, I've noticed that things between us have changed a bit. I don't know if it's just my perception or if there's actually some subtle tension in the air. Before, when we talked about the future, I felt like he saw the idea of us living together as a logical and natural step in our relationship. But now, I feel like my refusal has made him rethink our relationship. I worry that he sees me as someone who isn't committed to him or his family, even though the reality is that I just don't want to rush things. I have tried to explain to him that my decision is not due to a lack of love, but because I am still building my life and want to continue exploring my independence. I have told him that I enjoy spending time with him and his children, but that doesn't mean I should take on the role of a mother. He says he understands, but sometimes he makes subtle comments that make me feel guilty, like when he says that his kids need stability and that it's hard for him to do everything alone. Truth is, I am confused. I don't want to end the relationship, but I also don't want to feel like I'm being pushed into a role I'm not ready for. In the past few days, I've been reflecting on what I really want, and I've considered having a deeper conversation with him. I need to know exactly what he expects from me and whether he's willing to give me the time I need without pressuring me. Moreover, something that unsettles me is the way he perceives the concept of a relationship. I feel like to him, love means taking on responsibilities together immediately, while for me, love also involves individual growth before being able to fully share a life with someone else. I wonder if our differences in how we view relationships could be an obstacle in the long run. In the coming days, I plan to visit his house and talk to him honestly. I want to bring up my concerns without making him feel attacked, but I also want to make it clear that I can't commit to something I'm not ready for. I don't know how he will react, but I believe it's important to have this conversation before we make decisions that could impact our future. After several days of reflection, the uncertainty still weighed on me. I couldn't ignore the feeling that our relationship was moving too fast in a direction that didn't completely convince me. It wasn't about a lack of affection, but rather a difference in expectations. I knew that sooner or later I had to address the issue with him, but every time I tried to start the conversation, something held me back. Maybe it was the fear of losing him, or perhaps the fear that he wouldn't understand my perspective without feeling rejected. That afternoon after work, I decided to stop by his house. His kids were playing in the yard while he watched them from the window. When he saw me, he smiled and came outside to greet me. I felt a lump in my throat, but I forced myself to stay composed. This was not the time for hesitation. "We need to talk," I said in a firm but calm voice. He slightly furrowed his brow, as if he already had an idea of what this was about. He invited me inside, and we sat in the living room. Kids remained outside, unaware of the conversation that was about to unfold. "Tell me," he said, resting his elbows on his knees. I took a deep breath before speaking. I've been thinking a lot about what we discussed regarding living together, the future, and what you expect from me in relation to your children, I said, trying to choose my words carefully. He nodded without interrupting, which gave me the courage to continue. I want to be honest. I care about you a lot. I like our relationship, and I enjoy spending time with you and the kids, but I don't feel ready to take on such a big role. I don't want you to feel like I'm leaving you alone, but I need my time. I can't just throw myself into a life I'm not ready for. There was a long silence. His eyes reflected a mix of emotions that I couldn't immediately decipher. Finally, he sighed and ran a hand through his hair. I understand your point of view, but I'm worried about what that means for us, he finally said. I don't want you to feel obligated to anything, but my kids are my priority. If you don't see yourself in this life with me, I'd rather know now. His tone wasn't aggressive, but his words carried undeniable weight. I felt a slight shiver run down my spine. It wasn't that I didn't see myself with him, but the pace at which we were moving felt overwhelming. I don't want to walk away from you, I stated. I just want us to take things slower, to build our relationship without feeling like I have to step into a role I'm not ready for. He looked at me for a long moment, and for a second I thought he would argue. But instead, he nodded. Okay, we'll take our time, he finally said, though there was a hint of doubt in his voice. I knew the issue wasn't entirely resolved. It was a conversation we would have to continue having as our relationship progressed. Although I felt momentary relief, deep down I knew the dilemma remained, lingering, waiting for the moment when we would have to face it again. The following days passed with apparent normalcy, but I could tell that something had changed. Though my boyfriend tried to act as usual, there was a subtle distance in his demeanor. He wasn't rude or indifferent, but he no longer talked as much about the future together or made long-term plans. A part of me wanted to believe it was just my imagination, but another part knew he was processing my words and what they meant for our relationship. As for me, I was caught in an internal dilemma. I wanted to be with him, but at the same time, I felt like my personal desires were constantly clashing with what the relationship required of me. I spent a lot of time wondering if I was making the right choice by staying or if deep down we were on different paths. Then, one night, while we were talking on the phone, something happened that left me even more confused. My mom and grandma already have a moving date, he said seriously. In 2 weeks, they'll be in their new home. My stomach tightened. I knew this moment would come, but I hadn't expected it to be so soon. How do you feel about that? I asked cautiously. I'm not going to lie, I'm worried. I know I can handle it alone, but it will be a big change for the kids and me. He paused. And well, I also thought about what we talked about living together. My breathing slowed. I knew this topic would come up again, but I hadn't expected it to resurface so soon after our last conversation. I don't want to pressure you, he continued, but I want you to know that if you decide to take that step, it would mean a lot to me. Not just because of the help, but because I truly want to build a life with you. Tense silence settled between us. My thoughts raced. On one hand, the idea of living with him still filled me with doubts, but on the other, I couldn't deny how much I cared about him and how much I wanted our relationship to work. I need to think it through, I responded honestly. I don't want to make a rushed decision. I understand, he said, though there was a hint of disappointment in his voice. When we hung up, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, feeling trapped between what I felt for him and what my instincts were telling me about the situation. I knew I had to make a decision soon, but the question remained, weighing on my mind. Was I truly ready to take that step, or was I just trying to convince myself that I was? Since that phone conversation, my thoughts had become a whirlwind of emotions that were hard to sort out. I felt the weight of the decision on my shoulders, standing at a crossroads where I couldn't afford to move forward without careful reflection. I wanted to be fair to myself and to him, but with each passing day, the pressure grew. Even though my boyfriend said he understood my need for time, I could see a certain restlessness in his eyes, as if he was waiting for me to change my mind at any moment. The days passed with apparent normalcy. We continued going out, sharing moments with his kids and enjoying each other's company, but something in our dynamic had shifted. I noticed he was more attentive to my reactions whenever we talked about the future, as if he was trying to decipher my thoughts before I could put them into words. His patience was evident, but so was the tension lingering between us. One afternoon, while we were walking through the park with the kids, one of them ran up to me with a bright smile. "When you live with us, can I teach you how to make my favorite breakfast?" he asked innocently. My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't expected the kids to already consider the possibility as something imminent. I looked at my boyfriend for help, but he only watched in silence, waiting for my response. I forced myself to smile. "Of course, when the time is right," I replied softly. The child seemed satisfied with my answer and ran back to his game, but I felt the air around me grow heavy. I couldn't help but wonder how much my boyfriend had talked to them about this. Had he made them believe it was a certainty? Or were they simply interpreting our interactions that way? When we arrived at his house and the kids went to their rooms, I knew I couldn't keep postponing the conversation. I needed to understand his perspective better and make mine clear. "Have you told them anything about us living together?" I asked cautiously. He sighed and ran a hand over his face before answering. "I told them it's a possibility, that we're considering the idea. I didn't want them to get too excited, but I also didn't want to hide something that could affect them." I nodded slowly, trying to process his words. "The problem is that, for me, it's still not a decided thing, and they seem to see it as certain." "It's not my intention to pressure you," he said in a calm tone. "But I can't help but think about how hard it will be when my mom and grandma leave. I'm not asking you to take care of the kids, I just want us to be in this together." His sincerity moved me, but it also filled me with doubts. I could understand his situation, but that didn't change the fact that I wasn't ready. I knew he wasn't expecting me to take on a maternal role immediately, but wasn't it inevitable that the responsibility would fall on me if we lived under the same roof? I didn't want to deceive him or myself. That night, when I got home, I tried to imagine my life in that house. I saw myself waking up early to help with the morning routine, preparing lunches, dealing with school issues, and taking on tasks I had never considered part of my immediate future. It wasn't an unpleasant image, but it also wasn't the one I had planned for myself at this moment. The days passed, and the departure of his mother and grandmother drew closer. He tried not to mention it too much, but I could see how the worry consumed him. I cared about him, I really did, but that didn't make my doubts disappear. One night, while we were sitting in his living room, he finally asked, "Are you still thinking about it?" I nodded, but I felt the need to be completely honest. "Yes, but I still feel like it's not the right time for me." He closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath before speaking. "I don't want you to feel like I'm forcing you, but I also need to know what this means for us. If you tell me you need more time, I'll respect that. But if you tell me you'll never see yourself in this life with me and my kids, then we need to talk about what that means for our relationship." His tone was calm, but the emotional weight of his words was undeniable. I felt a lump in my throat. I didn't want to hurt him, but I also couldn't ignore what I felt. "I can't tell you with certainty what will happen in the future," I admitted. "But what I do know is that right now, I don't want to rush into something I'm not ready for. I want to be with you, but I don't want that to mean I have to take on a role I'm not prepared for yet." He nodded slowly, but didn't say anything for a moment. Finally, he reached out and took my hand in his. "I appreciate your honesty. I won't lie, this is hard for me. But I'd rather you tell me now than pretend to be okay with something you don't truly want." His understanding gave me some relief, but I also knew this wasn't the end of the conversation. Our relationship was in delicate territory, in an uncertain pause where we were both trying to find a balance between what we wanted and what we could offer. That night, as I made my way home, I couldn't stop wondering what all of this meant in the long run. Could our relationship overcome this difference? Or would we eventually be forced to go our separate ways? Since that night when we opened up to each other, the dynamic between us had subtly shifted. Although my boyfriend remained affectionate and understanding, there was a sense of caution in our interactions, as if we were both carefully measuring our words and actions to avoid unnecessary conflict. It wasn't an unbridgeable distance, but it was a constant reminder that we were at a decisive point. The days passed quickly, and the moment when his mother and grandmother would leave was drawing closer. I wondered if he was expecting me to change my mind at the last minute and agree to move in with them. I knew it wasn't fair to keep him in that uncertainty, but it was also difficult for me to give him a definitive answer when I wasn't even sure how I wanted to proceed. One weekend, he invited me to spend the day at his house. I accepted, hoping to maintain our connection, but when I arrived, I noticed a different atmosphere. His mother and grandmother were packing their things into boxes. The children were running around the house with boundless energy, and he seemed more tense than usual. "It's been a tough day," he said quietly as we settled in the living room. I studied him carefully. His face showed exhaustion but also concern. The reality of his family's imminent departure was hitting him harder than he had expected. "Have you thought about how you'll manage everything when they leave?" I asked cautiously, not wanting to sound intrusive. "Yes, but I won't lie to you. I still feel like it's going to be too much," he admitted. "I'm not afraid of doing it alone, but I know it will be difficult. And even though I don't want to make you feel obligated, I'd like you to be more present in this." I felt a pang in my chest. Not because he was pressuring me directly, but because I understood his distress and knew that, in some way, he expected more from me. I couldn't blame him for that. However, I couldn't betray my own feelings just to ease his burden. "I don't want you to think I don't care," I responded, carefully choosing my words, "but I also need to make sure that any decision I make is the right one for me. I don't want to take a step and then realize it wasn't what I truly wanted." He nodded slowly, as if trying to absorb my words without showing frustration. That moment, one of his children ran up and jumped onto the couch between us. "Dad, can I sleep with you when Grandma isn't here anymore?" he asked innocently. My boyfriend smiled and ruffled his hair affectionately. "Of course, champ." The child turned to me and grinned. "And will you come to sleep with us too?" My heart tightened at the question. I knew there was no easy answer. I glanced at my boyfriend, but he didn't intervene, waiting for me to answer on my own. I swallowed hard and smiled softly. "That depends on many things," I said, not wanting to give false expectations. The child seemed satisfied with my response and ran back to his room, leaving us once again in an uncomfortable silence. "They really like you," he said after a moment. "And I know you care about them too, even if it's hard for you to admit." I couldn't deny what he was saying. I had grown fond of his kids, enjoyed their antics, and felt happy seeing them smile. But that didn't change the fact that the life he was offering me required a level of maturity and readiness that I didn't yet feel I had. "I know," I murmured, "and that's why I want to be honest about all of this. I don't want to play with anyone's emotions, especially theirs." He sighed and ran a hand over his face. I could see his internal struggle between wanting to insist and respecting my position. Finally, he nodded. "Just tell me you're not going to leave," he said, almost pleading. "That even if we don't live together now, you still want to build something with me." I felt my chest tighten. I couldn't imagine my life without him at this moment, but I also knew that relationships couldn't be sustained by feelings alone. Still, I didn't want to see him suffer any more than he already was. "I'm not going anywhere," I assured him sincerely. "I just need you to give me the time I need to find my place in all of this." He didn't respond immediately, but after a few seconds, he took my hand and squeezed it gently. "That's enough for me for now." That night, as I returned to my apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling of being trapped between two worlds. One where I could continue enjoying my independence, building my life at my own pace, and another where I became part of a family, learning to balance my needs with those of others. I didn't know which one would ultimately define my future, but I did know that it had to be a choice I made for myself, not a decision driven by the pressure of the moment. The next day, my best friend called me. It had been a while since we had a deep conversation, so I decided to confide in her. After listening attentively, she asked me a question I hadn't considered until that moment. "And what if you decided to take a step back in the relationship? Not because you don't love him, but because you feel like this is moving faster than you can handle?" "I don't want you to think I don't care," I responded, carefully choosing my words. "But I also need to make sure that any decision I make is the right one for me. I don't want to take a step and then realize it wasn't what I truly wanted." He nodded slowly, as if trying to absorb my words without showing frustration. That moment, one of his children ran up and jumped onto the couch between us. "Dad, can I sleep with you when Grandma isn't here anymore?" he asked innocently. My boyfriend smiled and ruffled his hair affectionately. "Of course, champ." The child turned to me and grinned. "And will you come to sleep with us too?" My heart tightened at the question. I knew there was no easy answer. I glanced at my boyfriend, but he didn't intervene, waiting for me to answer on my own. I swallowed hard and smiled softly. "That depends on many things," I said, not wanting to give false expectations. The child seemed satisfied with my response and ran back to his room, leaving us once again in an uncomfortable silence. "They really like you," he said after a moment. "And I know you care about them too, even if it's hard for you to admit." I couldn't deny what he was saying. I had grown fond of his kids, enjoyed their antics, and felt happy seeing them smile. But that didn't change the fact that the life he was offering me required a level of maturity and readiness that I didn't yet feel I had. "I know," I murmured, "and that's why I want to be honest about all of this. I don't want to play with anyone's emotions, especially theirs." He sighed and ran a hand over his face. I could see his internal struggle between wanting to insist and respecting my position. Finally, he nodded. "Just tell me you're not going to leave," he said, almost pleading. "That even if we don't live together now, you still want to build something with me." I felt my chest tighten. I couldn't imagine my life without him at this moment, but I also knew that relationships couldn't be sustained by feelings alone. Still, I didn't want to see him suffer any more than he already was. "I'm not going anywhere," I assured him sincerely. "I just need you to give me the time I need to find my place in all of this." He didn't respond immediately, but after a few seconds, he took my hand and squeezed it gently. "That's enough for me for now." That night, as I returned to my apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling of being trapped between two worlds. One where I could continue enjoying my independence, building my life at my own pace, and another where I became part of a family, learning to balance my needs with those of others. I didn't know which one would ultimately define my future, but I did know that it had to be a choice I made for myself, not a decision driven by the pressure of the moment. The next day, my best friend called me. It had been a while since we had a deep conversation, so I decided to confide in her. After listening attentively, she asked me a question I hadn't considered until that moment. "And what if you decided to take a step back in the relationship? Not because you don't love him, but because you feel like this is moving faster than you can handle?" I fell silent. I had never truly considered that possibility. What would that mean for us? Was I willing to risk our relationship just because I needed space? "I don't know," I finally admitted, "but I guess I need to figure that out before it's too late." My friend sighed on the other end of the line. "Just make sure that whatever decision you make is yours, and not the one others expect you to make." Her words lingered in my mind long after the call ended. I knew I had to make a decision soon, but what I still didn't know was what price I'd have to pay, no matter which path I chose. The days passed, and the uncertainty still weighed on me. The conversation with my best friend had planted a doubt I couldn't ignore. Was I really on the right path? Or was I forcing myself to fit into a life I wasn't ready for just because I was afraid of losing him? I didn't want to realize too late that I had made the wrong decision. Finally, the day of his mother and grandmother's move arrived. The house was filled with boxes, memories, and suppressed emotions. His family tried to keep their composure, but it was clear that saying goodbye wasn't easy. My boyfriend kept himself busy helping with the move, though his expression betrayed him. His kids were restless, aware that their world was about to change. I watched everything from a corner, feeling like an outsider. Not because I didn't care, but because I couldn't shake the feeling that I didn't truly belong in that space. It wasn't my home, it wasn't my life. And as much as I wanted to force myself to fit in, the reality was that I wasn't ready for it yet. When the house fell silent after his family left, he collapsed onto the couch, exhausted both physically and emotionally. I sat beside him, but this time I didn't take his hand. Something inside me told me that this would be the last time we sat together like this. "It's been a long day," he murmured without looking at me. "Yeah," I replied softly, feeling the weight of what I was about to say. I took a deep breath, searching for the best way to express what I had been thinking for weeks. I didn't want to hurt him, but I also couldn't keep prolonging something that, deep down, I knew wouldn't work in the long run. "I love you, but I can't keep ignoring what I feel," I began, my throat tightening. I've tried to convince myself that, with time, I would change my mind, that eventually I would feel ready for this life. But the truth is, I don't know. And it's not fair to you or the kids for me to stay without being completely sure. He closed his eyes and nodded slowly, as if he had already expected my words deep down. "I knew it," he whispered. "I just didn't want to admit it." The silence between us was louder than any words. Finally, he turned to face me, a mix of sadness and understanding in his eyes. "I don't want to lose you, but I also don't want you to stay out of obligation," he said in a hoarse voice. "If this is what's best for you, I'll accept it, even if it hurts." Tears burned in my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. I didn't want this to end in pain, but rather with the certainty that we both deserved something better. Him, a partner who could share his path without doubts, and me, the freedom to discover my own without guilt. "I'll always carry you with me," I murmured. But this isn't our story. Not the way we imagined it. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and took a deep breath. Finally, he nodded. I wish you the best, he said, genuine sadness in his voice. And I hope you find what you truly want. I slowly stood up, feeling the weight of the moment in every step. There were no more words, just one last look before I walked out the door. Cold night air hit my face as I stepped outside, bringing with it a strange mix of relief and sadness. I hadn't made the easiest decision, but I had made the right one. And as I walked toward my apartment, I knew that this was a new beginning. One where, for the first time in a long time, I was choosing for myself.